Happy Christmas. Well, when I say that, it doesn't really look like Christmas has hit this house, and I have to apologise. That's because we have a rule in our house that if we have building work going on, we don't put up the decorations till after the building work is finished. That means this year the decorations are going up on Christmas Eve. And if I want to record all the stuff before Christmas so I can have a bit of time off on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and spend most of Boxing Day with the family other than the live and a few other things, that means I can't really wait for the decorations to be up to do the recording. But I wanted to say Happy Christmas. I hope you all enjoy this. This is a very special one of two historians. There are gonna be others who I am looking forward to meeting, to talking with, but I have to say, talking with Drac, talking with Sal, talking with Jamie Seedle, they are old friends. They are Bilge Pump's pals. And it is a lot of fun to spend some time talking to them. And without much ado, please go to see us talk about logistics.
Hello, everyone, and if you're seeing this, this is going to be going out on Christmas Day. Literally, this is Christmas Day's video, so Merry Christmas. Hope you had a nice time. Me and Sal have decided to put this out on Christmas Day. Well, I've decided, and Sal's learning about this right now, because I have seen what's on the Christmas TV schedule in the UK, and honestly, I think you'll need it. It's the usual... I'm not sure what it is about the UK, and you can tell me whether America's the same, but they have managed to find the most depressing programs they have on Sunday evenings, and as normally, and they've given them the most depressing storyline they can possibly have. So everyone looking around on Christmas Day is going to look around and go, well, at least I'm not in that, is my view. I'm not sure what it is about the UK television, which just decides that they're going to try and depress everyone on Christmas Day. But it is... Ay, caramba.
It's different in the
And
U.S. We're gonna have like 24 hours of Elf and football. That's our Christmas Day.
honestly, I'd prefer that, even though, of course, we have to state that it's American football rather than what the rest of the world calls football. But we'll leave that to one side. You know, we can leave the debate of rugby versus American football and which one is actually played by real men to one side for this discussion.
Listen,
Actually, no. The thing is, I've played both, so I can see why in one you have body armor and the other one you don't. But I can
I,
also tell you that it does either way. If I'm slamming into you for a tackle, it doesn't matter whether you have the armor or not. You're gonna feel it.
I played lacrosse and I had a helmet and pads and a stick with a ball and to me rugby players were insane. I anytime you have to like tape your ears so they don't get ripped off, to me is that's a sport right there. That's
I had to take my because I was a front row prop. I had to tape my ears and my nose to make sure they weren't to try and protect them in the scrum.
I think my
So
one of my roommates in college was a rugby player, and he had a T-shirt. I remember having his T-shirt forever, and I loved the T-shirt. It was like, it's like I'm a blood donor. I play rugby, and it was just like it was great. It was such a great shirt.
I swear most of the injuries I feel when the wind's blowing the wrong way are from rugby rather than anything else. Anyway, the great thing about having Sal here is you really don't need an introduction, but just in case people do, please do introduce yourself. Because if
Yeah,
people haven't seen what is going on in shipping, I find that strange. It's kind of like when I had Drac on, and Drac went, should I do an introduction or not? I went, well, you should do, because there's always the possibility that there's someone who's watching my channel who doesn't know who you are.
there is that one person on the planet who doesn't know Drac from his channel or Naval Institute and everything else he does,
No,
or haven't run into him and you on a museum ship somewhere on the planet. But my name is Sal Mercogliano. I'm a professor of history over at Campbell University in North Carolina. I'm a former merchant mariner, turned historian and kind of shipping analyst, and I run a little plucky little YouTube channel called What's Going On with Shipping.
when you say plucky, let's put this in contrast. I am currently 812 away from my 15,000 target. What is going on with shipping?
It's plucky.
It is currently on 300, nearly 350,000 subscribers.
Uh, if Alex, we've had this conversation for a long time, and it's like, and I asked you and Drac early on when I started the channel, if you would have told me where this would be today, 3 years later, I would say you're crazy. It's just I had no idea that people gave a ship about ships, and it's one of those little things. I couldn't delve into the history the way you do and Drac does. I mean, you guys have got that fairly well cornered in naval history side. So I decided to go look at commercial shipping. It's something that a lot of people don't look at, and for some
Mm.
reason, things keep happening with shipping that gets them in the news. It just seems to be a very common event that bad things happen with ships and people are interested in them. Right now, it's Russian tankers sinking in the Black Sea. Next week, who knows what's going to be.
Yeah, it's always fun. There's always well, the Russian tanks sinking in the Black Sea are not surprising. They're using the ones which were mainly canal ones for going across the Black Sea. And whilst the Black Sea isn't the roughest sea in the world, it's rough enough when you're designed for canals to cause you trouble.
Not was when you're designed for canals, but when you're a 50-year-old Soviet design, and you, like you said, and
Yeah.
it was interesting. I posted just an image just the other day. I ran the track of these two ships back in 2021, a year before the Russia-Ukraine war, and when you look at their track, they're navigating all the way from St. Petersburg down into the Sea of Azov. And, because most people don't realize the inland waterway system of Russia, which is very extensive. You and I both and I know how essential it was during World War II and World War One for the Russians to keep themselves sustained. And, right now the Russians need that. One of the arguments I go back to is why the Russians invade Ukraine in February 2022 is to grab that northern coast of the Sea of Azov, Mariupol, Berdansk, so that they would have a nice safe environment for their ships to do these ship-to-ship transfers. A lot of fuel, in the case of these tankers, comes from down that inland waterway system. They dump that fuel either ashore or directly into ships. And then those ships, those tankers, set sail and deliver the fuel. But because of the pesky Ukrainians and their unmanned surface vessels and their attacks on things like the Kerch Strait and the Kerch Bridge, now you got to take those little Russian tankers out into the Black Sea. Really not an environment they're designed to. They don't have the longitudinal support really to deal with. It wasn't even a storm; it was a gale.
Yeah.
And they broke apart. Two of them in the
Yeah.
Black Sea. One of them in the Sea of Azov. Matter of fact, the 109 sank in the Sea of Azov. And so it's really interesting to see. I made that connection. When I get a high five from H.I. Sutton over at Covert Shores, I'm very happy with myself because when he doesn't know something and I do, I feel really good.
I'd say also the fact the next level I keep expecting to hear is that Ukraine has started putting mines in those canals because that would cause the Russians so much trouble. They
Well,
they don't have the mine sweeping organization they used to, and those canals are massive, extensive, and they're dependent on. And frankly, they're worse. They're almost more exposed than the railways now
I think
because many of the major points of the railways have either already been hit or the Russians are now rushing to secure them, and so that leaves the canals as the next open piece. To my mind.
I think the Russians and the Ukrainians are very careful about escalating conflict on the Black Sea,
Mhm.
especially targeting their commercial ships. I know, obviously, as you know, and everyone who watches you knows, the Russians and Ukrainians have been dealing in a naval conflict for quite a while. We've seen that with the sinking of Moskva, the attack on Snake Island, and we've seen that kind of yin and yang back and forth across the Black Sea. What they haven't really done, and there has been attacks. We just saw a recent spate of them by the Russians against Ukrainian ships, really have targeted commercial vessels. It's been kind of a hands-off approach toward commercial vessels. The Russians have hit some vessels coming out of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have hit some Russian commercial vessels that were going down to Syria before the Syria revolution. But largely, they've hands off on the commercial because I think they're very worried about escalating this to that level. And I think the mines would be that if all of a sudden the Ukrainians started mining the rivers, which would shut down Russia's economy in a second. I mean, the Don River, which comes out of Rostov into the Sea of Azov, is kind of the Mississippi River or the Yangtze River of Russia. And what that would force the Russians to do then is to use their Kilo submarines against shipping coming out of Ukraine, maybe do a mining campaign of their own, and that gets into a mess. That turns the Black Sea into the Persian Gulf of the 1980s when Iran and Iraq were in the midst of the tanker war, hurling bombs and missiles at everybody. Uh, right now they're trying to wage a war without by keeping their economies alive. But I think if you get to the tipping point where Russia or Ukraine realize we have to do something here or else we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves, that's when you go and start targeting economics. At what point does Russia or Ukraine release unrestricted submarine warfare like the Germans did in 1917 against the British, when they realize we've got to win the war on land, so we have to, economically hurt our enemy? And I think when they do that, that would be an indication that, number one, you're seeing the last vestiges of, the final phase of that war come in.
I have to say though, with the Black Sea kilos, I am. They are apparently some of the vessel. Again, it's kind of like all those things. And we're completely off topic for our conversation today, but we'll just point out the Black Sea kilos are some of the ones which are like the Moskva. They seem to have maybe not received the same level of maintenance as the Northern Fleet and even the Pacific Fleet vessels are maintained, because the Black Sea Fleet has suffered from being what I would call the political fleet for quite a while. It's had these are nice but dumbs, and we're going to put them into political positions, but we need to give them experience, so we send them to the Black Sea Fleet ones in command, and that seems to have affected their maintenance. But actually, this does actually, I suppose it's off topic, but it isn't off topic because we're talking about logistics today. We're talking about the fact that naval warfare is often about, and naval history is often not just about, people talk about getting command of the sea. They forget about what you use the sea for. And the advantage the sea gives you is logistics. It allows you to move your forces. And that you can only do that if you have the things to move the forces with, which is why current governments really do need to learn some history.
Oh, I agree entirely. I think Nick Lambert's most recent book, talking about Mahan and sea power, is one that really rekindles that argument. He delves into Alfred Thayer Mahan beyond the first book, which is the toughest one to read. It is also the one that everyone reads the first chapter but reads nothing else. And, for the naval personnel, they come away with the idea of decisive battle. That's the key. That's Mahan. He talks about decisive battle. But when you read below the level and you get past the first book of Mahan, and particularly when you look at his books on the Napoleonic Wars, he's talking about trade. He's talking about the essential nature of trade. The why you have navies is to defend trade and to move goods by the sea, which is still the most cost-effective means to do that. I go back to a book written by Rose George over a decade ago, where English journalist, she writes a book called 90% of Everything, which talks about the fact that even to this day, England is dependent on 90% of everything coming in by ship. And understanding logistics, and this is where I got into this, by the way, is my take on things had been military logistics, specifically naval logistics. I was in the first Persian Gulf War. I was in the Persian Gulf, and I saw laid out on the ramps there in Daman, the port of Daman, the entire 1st and 3rd Armored Division of the American 7th Corps coming out of Europe. And I was like, wow, that's impressive. How do you do that? How do you move 2 entire armored divisions, an entire armored corps in the span of about a month or two? And it delved me into looking at military logistics. It's delved me into looking at commercial logistics. And to me, it is the thing that, I for the life of me don't understand how the Royal Navy thinks they're going to operate without logistic ships underneath them. It just, it's not a possibility. You can have all the aircraft carriers in the world. But if you do not have the logistics with them, they become a very short fused element. I just wrote a piece. I wrote a piece for G Captain, and I did a video on this where I talked about the grounding of an American oiler. An oiler is one of these ships that resupply, battle groups for the United States. It was the Lincoln Battle Group in the Indian Ocean, and the ship was the USNS Bighorn, and it ran aground. It ran aground and was taken out of action. And what that demonstrated is how vulnerable logistics were, that the U.S. Navy had to scramble to find a suitable alternative for it, and they couldn't. And what they had to do was strip the Lincoln of its escorts. They sent half of them away. They had to impress a commercial tanker to provide a modicum of fuel to the Lincoln, even though it's a nuclear aircraft carrier. It still needs fuel for its aircraft. And they really had to hustle to do it. And if I'm an enemy, why go toe to toe with an enemy's battle fleet when I can sink their logistics, their supply ships, and after a few days, their carrier, their strike group, their battleships, whatever time period you're in, has to sail away because they don't have the means to stay forward deployed. Logistics is
Well,
to me
look,
is the way to go.
I think the problem is it's not just it's not selling it to the navies because
Mm.
I talked to the Royal Navy, I talked to the U.S. Navy, I talked to all these navies, and they're all sold on the one. It's selling it to the politicians because
Yep.
with the politicians you usually hear discussions of teeth arm, teeth. It all matters some teeth. So don't go. Okay, so basically what you're saying is you want a spear which is all head, no shaft. Would that look stupid to you? This is the point about logistics. The logistics is the shaft. It's what you're pushing on. And the whole point about a spear is the longer the shaft is, up to a certain point, the more it allows you to keep the enemy far away from you so you can defend your squidgy bits so from their sharp object and poke their sharp object, poke their squidgy bits with your sharp object. And that's what logistics is. It's your shaft or your spear. But they don't trying to explain this. It's kind of like Albion and Bulwark with the Royal Navy currently, and etc. Getting rid of those. Those things, they're landing platform docks. Those are logistics assets. People forget amphibious shipping is logistics assets. They're about supplying troops over the sea, over the beach. They're about getting these forces ashore and about keeping them supplied. They're about being able to. They're maneuver assets. They are warfighting assets, but they're not warfighting in terms of they're supposed to go out and kinetically kill. So they're often valuable for a long time. So when people turn around and go, well, these ships are this old, so they must not be useful anymore, you sort of go, no, because their purpose is not to go and do that. There are reasons you need new modern submarines. The half-life of a submarine is dependent on how many dives it's gone underwater, how many times it's stressed its hull out. That's the effect of submarine's life. A modern escort can only be upgraded so much before you need to rip it. It's cheaper to get a new one before you have to fit it because you have to fit new weapon systems, new sensors, and new power supply to support it all, which is the whole problem with the Burkes. They've sort of reached the end of the design life. You can no longer upgrade the design anymore, and this is why you've got to produce something new, which is forcing the U.S. Navy to have panic attacks over it. Because it's trying to get that through. I think a nice way. I'm surprised they haven't just put a new design and called it, I don't know, Super Burke, because that worked with the Super Hornet to the Hornet. That got it through Congress. Just call it the Super Burke, and you'll get it through. That's the thing. But the whole point is with the logistics ships, with things like the LPDs, etc. They can stay in service for a very, very long time. As long as they still work, because all you have to really do upgrade on is the radios and keep the engines going. And those things are quite easy to keep upgrading and to keep going, especially when you don't need them to go startling high speeds. They don't need to do 60, 70 knots. They're quite happily poodling around the world at 18 knots, and that's fine.
It is the platform that is key. If you look at the operations done by RFA LSDAs, like the Mount Bay, during hurricane operations, that's the type of platform you want. It's a connector. It provides you the ability to surge logistics ashore. Again, it could be providing for military, but it could also be providing for disaster relief, for humanitarian operations, for a whole variety of issues. And one of the big concerns I have is that, navies and militaries love to write about the combat systems. They love to talk about it, and they get really enamored with it, and they focus on it. In the U.S., we love to talk about the battle aspects, but me, I like to get behind the scenes and talk about the issues that are underwriting. I did a whole, video and articles on the 6 oilers at the very beginning of World War II. Everyone can give you the battle history of the 6 carriers that the United States Navy had at the beginning of World War II. Lexington, Saratoga, Wasp, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. But right behind them were 6 Navy fast oilers that were absolutely essential to keep those ships forward deployed. And one of the things that we realized very quickly at the time of Pearl Harbor was the Japanese pulled off something we didn't think was possible. We thought the operating range for a carrier strike group was about 2,000 to 2,500 miles because that's what we operated under. And it's like, you can't really operate any further than that. No one foresaw the Japanese would be able to not just take a carrier strike group, but 6 carriers and sail them 4,500 miles, execute a 2-wave launch attack against Pearl Harbor, and then retreat back. And to me, the most amazing thing about Kido Butai in the first 6 months of World War II is not really their, everyone wants to look at different aspects. They want to look at their aircraft, they want to look at their ability to get aircraft in the ground. It is their
Yeah.
range and the amount of miles they steam is just like incredible. If you think on December 7th they're off the coast of Oahu, by April they're off of Ceylon, Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean. And then in May, two of them are down in Coral Sea, and then in June, the other four are up off Midway. They are sailing an amazing distance. I'm always amazed by the Royal Navy illustrious carriers in World War II. I want to do a study where I just look at where they sail. Because when you look at their sailing distances, it's amazing where they go. They have to, get around Africa to get into the Eastern Med, and the amount of miles put on them are just incredible. And again, that's
Well,
logistics. You have to have either the base infrastructure set up so that they can refuel,
yeah.
or in the case of the U.S. Navy, develop the underway replenishment to operate them.
Well, this is the reason why. Sorry, I'm doing this is remembering the conversation I had with Drac, because we did, of course, the aircraft carriers. It's one of the reasons why building the Malta class makes sense after the end of World War II. It's because the Royal Navy's had so many miles onto their carrier force, they frankly all need to be retired. They're all worked to death already. It's just
They
let
wore
them
out.
rest.
I mean, it's just wore out. It's like driving a brand new car and putting 100,000 miles on it in the first year. It's the amount of wear and tear that's put on them. But again, it goes to principles of operation. How do you want to operate your fleet? And logistics is always the big constraint. If you look at the United States Navy early in the Pacific War, again, the idea is, the Eisenhower, the Enterprise Strike Group is going out to Wake Island to deliver VMF 211, a dozen Wildcats to it. It's 2,500 miles to Wake, and they don't take an oiler with them. When they arrive back at Pearl Harbor, on December 8th, the day after the attack, Enterprise is at 50% fuel. The three cruisers are at 30%. The destroyers are at 20%. That's the limit. And that's not without hard steaming, launching aircraft every day in combat operations. And they launched a lot of aircraft, that strike group, because Halsey had them. But the U.S. realized, listen, we need to be able to deploy our aircraft carriers in a much longer range. When Lexington in January goes to hit Wake Island, they're assigned an oiler, the Netchez. The problem is Netchez is sunk off the coast of Hawaii by I-72, and that cancels the strike. When Lexington goes at Rabaul in I think it's January or February of 42, it's going to launch the single rate strike against it. Gets called off because they get attacked. It took three oilers to support them to get down there. And one of the things that becomes very obvious is your logistics parameters, what you have. And unfortunately, what has happened in both Royal Navy, the British military, the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy, is we've gotten very comfortable with logistics. We have uncontested logistics. We have been able to sustain ourselves on very short distances. I'm amazed that the Royal Navy, who had to deploy 7,000 miles north to south to the Falklands in 82, forget this, because to me, I take that map, flip it on its side, and I sit there and say, that's going to be the west coast of Taiwan in the Pacific for the United States. And how many RFA oilers and stuffed tankers did it take to maintain just a two-carrier platform task force and an amphibious element to do it? And it's just, everyone loves to look at the one Vulcan bomber that hits Falklands and, and how many refueling it took. Magnify that by ships, and you get the idea of how difficult this is. And there were no Argentine submarines, interdicting the 7,000-mile supply line.
But the trouble is, as I reminded someone the other day, we are now further from the Falklands War than the Falklands War was from World War II.
Exactly right.
And we are dealing with not just a generation of politicians, but we're dealing with a generation of media, and everything else, which doesn't really think about this. The classic example I use is Max Hastings, who is very lovable in so many ways, but spends so much time being rude about aircraft carriers, and yet he was one of the people deployed down to the Falklands.
I've read his Battle of Falklands book many times.
You went down there. How do you do that operation without all these supply ships? But sometimes you read his books and his writings, and you think the army managed to just float down there and just sort of appeared in the Falklands, and you go, they didn't. But no, he's a actually affable bloke. He's an affable bloke. I just do not. He seems to have, for me, it's just that you cannot seem to get this through to him. Actually, on the subject of also of the early ones, I was looking around because I not only have Mahan's book like this, I have a book of Mahan's later writings, which is a really good collection you can now find on Amazon. I was trying to look it to find it, and I can't find the book. It's probably going to jump out at me later when I finish.
Yeah, John Samita did a great book on that. I mean, he's the one,
Yeah.
John, I would argue John did a great book. He looked at Mahan and really contextualized his writings, really indexed them and looked at them. But I think Nick did a really good job in really because Nick and I kind of have a same issue here about economics and the role of trade and how vitally essential it is. And it's really tough today. I think if you look at the Red Sea, for example, I mean, we're a year into the Houthi and the Red Sea. Navies are trying to put their arms around, handle how do you deal with the Houthis, because back in the day, if we're doing this pre-World War II, it's national merchant marines. It's the British, it's the Americans, it's Germans, it's nationality merchant marines. That's not what's sailing through there now. It's ships flagged in Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands, owned by international multinational corporations. And do you protect ships from other registries? Do you protect ships that are owned by your country but not flagged in your country, or do you protect ships that are carrying trade for you? And that really becomes a tough thing. You get for the United States, for example, you have all this press about the Eisenhower strike group that went down there and was engaged in more naval combat than since World War II. We give everyone combat action ribbons. We laud the battle group commander, the captains on the Eisenhower, who Chowder Hill, who's a great guy. But then we hand it over to the European Union, Operation the Speeds, and you get a comment in Lloyd's the other week from the commander of the European Union's naval forces down there. It's like, hey, I can't do this. I got 3 ships. I'm not defending everyone. It's like I'm lucky to defend a couple of ships sailing through here every now and then. And now you have these massive strikes being staged against the Houthi by the Truman battle groups that's sailing through, and then now the Israelis. And the Houthi have done something that I would argue that the Germans weren't really able to do in 2 world wars, and that is choke a supply line. They've actually been able to, really interdict for a year a supply line and force shipping to go around Africa. That's up there with the Kriegsmarine and the Imperial German Navy.
I'd say there's 2 reasons for this. One, if we consider what would have happened in, I don't know, the 1890s, an equivalent situation, there would have probably been the British Empire, probably would have been the Royal Navy turning up in the 1890s, because and they would probably have not just turned up and bombarded. There might have been a naval brigade put ashore, and the usual explanation would have been given of don't do this again, which you could do in that time period. You can't necessarily do that today, and that's one of the things. The schematics have changed in some regards. The rules of the game have changed. The navies are trying to work out how to deal with the situation in this world, because I think one of the problems we're dealing with is people presumed that the world was going to go unipolar after the Cold War, because the Cold War had been bipolar. You and I probably both thought the same thing whenever people told us to. Went, why? Why do you think it's going to be so organized and orderly? Because it's gone back to multipolar. It's gone back to what it was like pre-World War One, sort of during the interwar years, when there is a first power amongst the world. America is definitely the first amongst equals, but there are lots of regional powers and major and global powers and major powers and minor powers, and everyone's got their own things, and they might orientate their capabilities. And one of the things you find is people are really surprised when they realize it's not just people who min-max their capabilities in games. Countries actually min-max their capabilities sometimes. And a country which might otherwise be absolutely laughably weak can be incredibly strong in certain areas, and if they deploy that correctly, can be really difficult to deal with. The world's complicated. It's a mess.
Well, you and I both know from teaching this all the time is the balance of power concept post 1815. Congress of Vienna comes in. You don't want a unipower like France to emerge under Napoleon that requires literally the combined forces of everyone to put him down, not once but twice. And the period from 1815 to 1991 was a period of bipolar relations, and I'm not saying that it's personality. It's like there were 2 kind of axes running around
Yeah.
at all times. And when the U.S. emerges as the superpower, the hyperpower post Cold War, not everybody agrees with that. Listen, I'm an American. I'm the first one to sit there and say it's not always great to be number one, because when you're number one, everyone's nipping at your heels. And I think everyone got kind of, comfortable. That post 90s, early 2000s was seen as a period of, hey, history's, history's dead. It's the
Yeah.
Fukuyama, the end of history, and we're in this new era.
Oh.
And it just, everyone who had a brain knew that's not going to last. It's just not going to last. And then you get involved in 20 years of conflict in the Middle East, in fighting terrorism. And unfortunately, everyone kind of turns their blind eye to what was happening on the sea, and the rise of China, and kind of multipolarism on the high seas. What you were talking about with, how to deal with the Houthis, in early 1800s, the U.S. deals with the Barbary pirates. Every time I write anything about the Houthis, someone's going
Yeah.
to write Barbary pirates, guaranteed.
Yeah.
And what everyone always forgets about the Barbary pirates is, yes, the U.S. Navy went in and chastised their insolence, and we put the Marines ashore, and we get the shores of Tripoli. But what everybody forgets is, not only do we do the shores of Tripoli, where we put forces on the ground and we invade Tripoli, we pay the Tripolitans off in the end. That's the other element of it. It's like, it's military force, and we also bribe them. We also, give them what they kind of wanted, but not
Which
as
is
much.
kind of what the Britain had been doing, because honestly, Britain had gone, which is cheaper, bribing them or keep having the Navy have to do the work out there.
Right. But nobody wants to read that part, and nobody wants to talk about that part. That's my issue with the Houthis. Like, bribe them. It's like, and if you can't bribe the Houthis, you got to bribe the people who are forcing the Houthis out there, and that's the Iranians. And the problem is, the U.S. just doesn't talk to the Iranians, and that
Or
creates a problem.
the other traditional method the British used, of course, if you can't get the Houthis on, then you basically go, right then, so who are fighting you? Oh, it's the Yemeni government. How much money do you need to properly sustain your war, to keep the Houthis occupied on them?
Right. And you do everything you can through proxies
And
and everything else to maintain it.
and before people start going, well, that's not nice, all these things, you have to get very quickly away from international relations, away from the concept of bad guys and good guys. It's whilst movies are nicely black and white and nicely, that's not the case. Saying that China's on the rise does not make them a bad person. What makes them a bad person, a bad actor, is how they choose to rise and how they choose to act on the world stage, and that's usually in terms of relation of our interests. And I always find it funny when some people go, "Well, we shouldn't be doing that because that's us interfering." And you go, in a nice way, your way of life depends on those interests. So when we say, so in a nice way, protecting those interests matter. It's not nice. International relations is not about being necessarily the nice person or the bad person. It's about doing what you have to do, sometimes to survive, sometimes to thrive, and sometimes to just make it to the next day.
It's that practicality of realpolitik. I mean, it's the Kissinger
Yeah.
argument, basically. It's you have to do what is practical to do it. And to me, that was the, when the U.S. announces in December of 2023 that they're sending the Eisenhower Group in, and we're going to sit there and put a line of destroyers, U.S. and Royal Navy destroyers in, and we're going to whack a drone. That's not sustainable. It just isn't. It's just, because you can be 99.9% effective, but it's that 0.1 that's going to drive up war risk insurance, and it's going to force commercial ships to go the other route. You have to come up with another method of doing it. And
I have to admit, the people I'm surprised about are the Egyptians, because it's going to have had an effect on the Suez Canal.
It does. Oops. Sorry, I think my son's on.
My listeners are used to my fluffy research assistant demanding all sorts of things all the time. They don't worry.
That is my two right there. But I agree with you. The Egyptians are in a really tough position, Bud, because the Egyptians are one of the few states that recognize the Houthi, and they're dealing with the root problem, which is Gaza, which is on their border. And so they, if they go against the Houthi, I think the last estimate I saw is the Egyptians have lost $6 billion in Suez Canal tolls because of this. If they go against the Houthi and deploy the Egyptian Navy, which they have done, the Egyptian Navy's in the northern Red Sea right now. But if they deploy it against the Houthi, they have to worry about, Hamas turning those rockets 180 degrees and launching them at the Suez Canal and blocking the Suez Canal completely, instead of just, 40% blockage of the canal, they'd go to 100% blockage of the canal. And I think that's where the Houthis, I mean, the Egyptians find themselves in a very tough position. And again, it goes to the logistics. The Egyptians have to look at what is in their best interest. They'd rather get 60% tolls from the canal than 0% tolls from the canal. And the U.S., I think did an amazing job with the Eisenhower strike group, but again, failed to look at the bigger issue. I saw a talk being given by Admiral Wyckoff, who's the commander of the Fifth Fleet out in the Persian Gulf. And he gave a talk about the Houthi, and he sat there and said, "Listen, the Houthis' impact has been fairly minimal. The economy, that the commercial industry has basically self-regulated. They self-righted themselves. They're fine." And I'm like, that's wrong. You fundamentally misunderstand commercial shipping if you think that everything is fine. They've adjusted. They have sailed around Africa, but it's become more expensive, and that means inflation. That means higher costs. And
And that affects everything else.
right. And I'm always amazed, the Royal Navy prior to World War I had an entire office that was devoted to economic warfare at sea, and looking at economies. And I don't think my Department of Defense, and I know my Department of the Navy, doesn't have a similar aspect about that. They
To
don't
be honest,
understand.
that same office was kept going right up until the formation of NATO.
Right.
Because there's a chart I love to put up on my videos, and you've probably seen a few times, from about 1930 of where all the major big ships are in the world, and then that's what that chart office was doing. Every year they're providing an up-to-date chart of where all the ships are. These are the major shipping routes. These are what you need. And that's the data which they have, which is why HMS Liverpool can do that great thing of doing the Yasamaru incident, of literally plucking the Yasamaru off the coast of Japan, and there is nothing Japan can do about it. Because they know exactly where she's going to be. They're there waiting for her. And that's quite a scary thing if you think about it. If the Royal Navy can have a cruiser waiting off the Pacific side of Japan without the Japanese Navy knowing it's there, and can pluck out pretty much one of their pride of their merchant fleets from the sea and pull the people off it without the Japanese being able to do anything about it. And that happens before anyone knows in January 1940.
Yeah, and I'm working on a book right now on American shipping in World War I. And one of the things that's amazing to me is the post-World War I environment. Is during World War I, the United States, under what's called the Shipping Act of 1916, starts building commercial ships. They start a massive commercial shipbuilding program. And it gets kind of lost because of the one we do in World War II. But World War I is the second biggest one there is. And we're building ships for the British. Cunard is basically the agent that's operating for the British government. We're building commercial vessels for them. But we start up a massive commercial shipbuilding program, so much so that by 1918, we eclipsed the British in the building of commercial vessels, because obviously the British shipyards have got to shift over to building destroyers and escort vessels. They've changed their construction pattern.
They're also doing a whole lot of maintenance, repair, and all sorts of things. It's
wear and tear on the Royal Navy is just depleting it immensely. But, we all know post-World War I, we get the Washington Naval Treaty with this idea to keep parodying the navies. But one of the things that comes out during Versailles is the British are definitely concerned about the construction of American commercial vessels, because the U.S. is looking to put American vessels on key routes. There's a study done by the U.S. Shipping Board that sits there and says, listen, these are the 32 vital shipping routes. We need an American presence on these routes. And on all those routes are British ships. And it's like, this is a challenge to the Royal Navy and the British commercial industry. And what makes this a challenge, in the past it never was, because the U.S. couldn't do it, because coal-fired ships need coal. And the British had the coaling stations. They had the coaling stations, they had the piles. I mean, there was an entire industry within the British Merchant Marine just hauling coal to the coal stations so that ships could come in and coal. Well, U.S. building program shifts from coal fuel to oil. And oil is great, because oil is in the double bottoms. And most importantly about oil is you can put enough oil in a vessel to go round trip. You can go 10, 12,000 miles round trip on oil, which means the U.S. doesn't have to stop to load up with coal. It means that the U.S. can actually challenge the British commercial vessels on the high seas. And the British hate this. They don't like this at all. This is going to be a problem because they really don't want that competition. And so, as part of the parity deal in the naval agreement is the U.S. agrees to kind of curtail government support to this shipbuilding program. The U.S. when the Harding administration comes in 1921, there's this what's called return to normalcy, and they begin to phase out that program and sell off the ships and sell off the program so that the U.S. by the time you get to the eve of World War II, it's the second largest merchant marine in the world, but it's nowhere near the size of the British merchant marine. And
One of the
again, that's
interesting
that.
one of the
Go
interesting
ahead.
things about that, though, is reading that from the British side, is that the British, then the Admiralty and the Admiralty advice was they weren't worried about it because rather like with this is a run up to the Washington Treaty, Modern Versailles Treaty. They predicted that no matter what was agreed, even if the American government won't keep funding it, they're certain the Congress will curtail the funding whatever happens because they don't want to spend it. So, in a nice way, this is one reason. This is the fact that the Royal Navy's thinking of going into the Washington Naval Treaty is whatever they agree. If they agree parity to the Americans, that's fine because the Americans will never pay for it.
Right.
It's sort of there are levels of politicians who are afraid of you're talking quite right, but then on the Admiralty side, they're not bothered about it because they've spent years studying the American political system as part of their political research department. Pretty much, they've got going, and they've basically gone, yeah, it doesn't matter what we agree with the Americans, their government will never fund it. Their government, the phrase I think it is their government doesn't have the stamina.
Right. Well, I agree, and there was an issue about it because again, it was generating funding for the United States because
Yeah,
they
yeah,
were thinking that because one of the things that Wilson does before U.S. entry into World War One was really try to get some markets away from the British, particularly in America, in South America, Central America. Very big effort down there to do that, to start making those challenges, to get out into the Pacific, to start challenging the Japanese fleets that were out there. And so you're right, there is not going to be that long term interest, but the hope was it would become kind of self sustaining
yeah,
and be funding. And that was the big difference between the Navy buildup and the commercial buildup is that commercial will generate revenue, it'll generate money, it'll generate
yeah.
trade. But for the U.S., it really doesn't because of some poor management on it, the expenses associated with it. The British can operate ships much cheaper than the Americans because they use Dominion sailors on it. You can get some Lascars, you can get some Chinese, you can get some Africans, some Caribbean personnel on it. The U.S. had a proposal to put Filipinos on ships. Unfortunately, it died out. That would have been a really interesting development based on where Filipinos are today as the most dominant group of sailors in the commercial industry today. But the U.S. just does not have, I would argue, the wherewithal and really the focus that the British have on commercial shipping early on, and they really
Um,
come up short in that.
what I really laughed though is that one of the comments, and I'm doing this from memory, but if I remember correctly, one of the comments which was a response to the Americans don't have the stamina was, well, neither do our politicians.
Right. Well, I mean, it's always the way, isn't it? It's
Yeah, so basically, the Royal Navy's just going, yeah, in a nice way. They don't have the stand to keep it up, but luckily we have this. But it's entirely not thanks to the politicians at all. It's another case of, I sit there sometimes because I'm always trying to look at the reason why these things happen and why them, and I always got a question. I sometimes get sort of given people put all sorts of comments about on videos about whether I'm pro-British or whatever. So, well, I do go. I'm a British naval historian, so that's usually what I relate things to because that's where
right.
I started off, and that's sort of when a history I'm sort of looking at. But also because honestly, the wonderful thing about the British as a sort of history group is we tend to be quite so rude about ourselves in our own documents. In a way that most other countries are just. You go and read most nations' archival documents; they are very nice about themselves.
Well, the British tend to be, how should I say it? They criticize or self-critique. They're always kind of
Oh.
critiquing themselves, which unfortunately doesn't happen a lot in American documents. That happens. Like I said, I'm doing this book right now on World War One, so I'm reading a lot of
Mm.
archival information too, and I'm reading a lot of not biography, but personal letters. So I'm reading the personal letters of Admiral Sims, who's great. I mean, he just lays it all out. I mean, he's just very, very vocal about his
Yeah.
colleagues and some of the admirals and his dealings with the British. and it's really amazing. The he gets this allegation that he's very pro British. I think he's not pro British. I think he acknowledges that what's going on in Great Britain in 1917 and the plans of Jellicoe for convoying is the right move. And it's just like, and then he looks back at what's happening over in the U.S. It's like these people don't know what the frick is going on. It's like they are just so, and it's not that he's pro British, anti American. He's just anti knuckleheads who think they know what they're doing and have no clue. There's a big
Yeah.
debate that he gets involved with between himself and the chief of naval operations, Admiral Benson, and the British want to do these convoy operations, and a lot of focus is that the Americans are anti-convoy, the British are pro-convoy. It's not that; it's the Americans want to do a certain style of convoy, small convoys, 4 ships, and put a lot of vessels around them versus the big, massive convoys. And Sims, what's amazing to me in reading this about World War One is the arguments for World War Two convoy battles are right there in World War One. They're having the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
debates.
Oh, yes.
Sims literally writes a piece where he sits there and says, "You misunderstand what convoys are. Put a big convoy together. It is an offensive weapon. It brings the U-boats to you. This is what you need to do." And he's criticizing that, and he gets lambasted for it. Post World War One, there's a big fight between Sims and the Secretary of Navy, Josephus Daniels, and it really influences post World War One, up to World War Two decision making. I'm just reading now a new biography on Admiral King by Dave Conan. It just came out. And King, who's involved in this because he's on the staff of Admiral Mayo, the commander in chief of the Atlantic Fleet, he's like, man, I don't want to see this repeated post World War II. I don't want to fight between me and Forrestal, for example, the new Secretary of the Navy. And so there's a lot of hindsight that comes out of World War One into World War II.
One of the things I get amazed by when I'm sort of looking at these from me in that debate, especially in logistics, is where are the assets going to come from to do enough for that if you're running through supplies 4 ships at a time? It sounds lovely until you try and work that out in a table of getting all the supplies through and working out how many convoys that is.
It's exactly right.
You just, yeah.
Well, and that
Yeah.
also shows you the American mindset, because the American mindset is on troop convoys. We're focusing on troop convoys. We're not thinking about the convoys that have to get to Europe to sustain the British and the French. I mean, Sims sends a note back in April of 1917. It's like, listen, I just met with Herbert Hoover, who's running the food relief agencies here in Europe to feed Belgium and other European nations. And he's like, England is going to run out of food. It's like they are running out of food. It is one of the reasons that post World War One, there's a big drive, and especially World War Two, to make England more self-sufficient in food production. And it's like they are going to run out of food. And I always highlight to people, listen, like where England almost got starved out, it's not World War II, it's World War One. It's World War One
Yeah.
is where this was really close. And
That's always forgotten, is that actually the Germans are more successful submarine campaigns in World War One than World War Two. That it's far
Massively
closer,
so.
it's far higher risk. And then they talk about World War Two, and you go, actually, no, it wasn't. Although I would say today Britain is even worse for food security than it was
Yep.
in the run up to World War One, let alone the run up to World War Two. It is just terrible.
It is.
Yeah.
And,
Just
and,
don't
and
get
so,
me started on
Sims is making this argument. It's like, listen, we have got to, we got to use our resources the way we do. And he's in this great battle between him and another admiral by the name of Albert Gleaves about how to use the limited resources they have. They have a finite number of U.S. destroyers. And it's like, where do they need to be? And Sims is like, they need to be in they need to be in the Eastern Atlantic. They need to be in the Western approaches. I need to have them on the South Shore of Ireland guarding this one key route because this is where the U.S. Navy is needed. The British have the English Channel.
Yeah.
The British Navy have north of Ireland coming in through the Irish Sea and north of Scotland. This is my route, and I got to guard this, and I need as many assets as I can. And it's an amazing fight. It really is. And it talks all about expeditionary warfare. How do you sustain a destroyer flotilla of 35, 36 destroyers in Queenstown? I'm reading about the fuel issue. We need to bring tankers in. We need to charter tankers because there's not enough oil, so we need to bring oil in. We've got to bring food in because there's not enough food sustainment in here, so we got to bring in food ships in. And it's really, I'm getting into the real logistics of this and the kind of the meat of it because it gets glossed over very easily. But I would argue that it is the precursor for how the U.S. Navy will do its logistics across the Pacific in World War II. It's basically the guide they use.
It's the experience they can draw from. This
Right.
is as I've and I talk about this, and I'm not sure how much you're going to agree with this thesis or not, but I say, sometime in World War II, the Royal Navy is exercising a lot of its hang-ups from World War One. The whole Taranto strike, etc., and the other things. There are all these hang-ups they had from World War One of the fleet hiding in harbour. We've got to go attack them. There's the anti-submarine warfare of the capabilities of the fleet and how they do. The fact they've got things like the Black Swan class, which are basically the most dedicated ASW killing machine in the world. And then you look at their operations in World War Two and you go, they're really quite good at that. But see, it's for the US Navy, it's building on the experience of World War One. But they don't have the same hang-ups from World War One, but then they have hang-ups left after World War Two. And then you see them in the Cold War, the capabilities they're building, and they're basically excising the whole sort of, these are the things which we feel we didn't do what we wanted to do in World War Two.
No, I think you're exactly. I think
No.
you're exactly right. When you look at the cast of characters who are on these destroyers, these U.S. destroyers they're sent over. I mean, it's Halsey, it's Fletcher, it's Newton, it's all these guys it's Carpenter, it's all these admirals who are in key positions in World War II later on, and then it's admirals who weren't there who feel like they're left out, and it becomes a very interesting. But when you look at the strategies, it's amazing to me. By the time you get the convoy operations in full force, you've got 20, 30, 40 vessels coming across, screened by about 8 destroyers, up to a dozen destroyers, depending on the size of the convoy. But late in the war, they start realizing, because what they're dealing with is single submarine attacks against convoys. So all they have to do is, with an 8 destroyer or let's say a 6 destroyer screen, is when you get attacked by a submarine, is you peel 2 destroyers off, and this is what they come up with. This is their operational plan. Peel 2 destroyers off. You don't have sonar, you don't have ASDIC, so you go to the site where the sub is, and then you lay a depth charge pattern. They basically load the back of these vessels with about 50 depth charges, and then they go to the spot where the sub went down, and through a series of concentric circles, just drop depth charges every couple of minutes. And the plan isn't to sink the submarine, it's to keep it down. It's just to keep it suppressed because it can only move at 1 or 2 knots. The convoy sails away at 8 to 10 knots, and if you can keep it down for a few hours, those World War I German submarines can't catch up. It's one of the reasons why German submarines are much faster on the surface in World War II. The Type 7Cs are much faster than the types that they're using in World War I. But toward the end of the war, what's really interesting is they come up with this idea. It's like, you know what? If we design a hunter-killer group to sail with this convoy, it can peel off and stay longer and keep that submarine down till it surfaces, and then you sink it. If you look at what happens in 43 in the Battle of the Atlantic, that's how they sink submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic. They suppress the submarines, they keep them down for 24 hours, and they get them when they surface. And then they pile on them. And this is where the escort carriers, the destroyer escorts come in, and they work very effectively. And again, a lot of those tactics are developed in kind of in the proto stage in World War I. They're not quite fully mature. We don't quite have all the technology yet. We don't have sonar. We don't have forward firing hedgehogs and squids. We don't have escort carriers. So it's much more refined in World. But I agree with you that a lot of the angst that happens to the U.S. Navy post-World War II is the same angst the British Navy had post-World War I, is really trying to find roles and missions. What are we supposed to do? And how do we take the lessons from the war and apply them to this next conflict? I think the U.S. Navy has done a terrible, terrible job of documenting its role in the Cold War, for example. I think it's one of the reasons why it runs into so much problems with appropriations from Congress, because it doesn't talk about its role in Cold War. It still classifies things like ballistic missile patrols from the 1960s. Who cares? Why are those things classified? We should be talking about the deterrence missions of the 41 ballistic missile submarines, which are not even used anymore.
I can't really talk the Royal. The British still have stuff which is classified from prior to World War One for ship development.
I know, it's crazy.
Don't get me started. Okay.
Listen, the plans for the repulse may be useful someday, so we can't declassify those yet. And
No.
The Furious was ahead of its time with its single 18-inch gun.
No, there's stuff. I think it was. I was looking at the earliest things I was looking at were to do with the Lord Nelsons.
Oh God!
There's a file from them which apparently is still listed as undisclosed to the public, and they go, "How? It's the Lord Nelson class. They are, if anyone doesn't know, they are the design being produced contemporaneous to the dreadnoughts, just as an insurance in case the dreadnought design doesn't work. They are the previous style of battleship, the last generation the Royal Navy builds.
Alex, we're still not completely sure the dreadnought's going to work. That's the reason. I just, again, it's granted, it's been a long time since 1906, but again, we need that backup plan.
We have no more in service, just in case. Okay, all right. Started on the world. Ay, caramba. But no, it's logistics is those issues you keep coming back to, and one of the things you also have to explain what ships are doing. I had the conversation with Harry Bennett in the previous episode of this series, the two historians, and it was on naval culture. We're talking through the sort of the history of the naval culture and how that affects things and how that interprets things. And one of the things is the perceptions. Navies are not often very good at selling themselves to the public because they do have this habit of going off and doing their job out of the view. So if you're someone who's just reading newspapers in World War One, you could get the idea the army's always fighting all armies always fighting on the front, and they're always doing this work. But the Navy are just sitting up in Scapa Flow, sitting around just doing nothing for the entirety of the war. And that's not what they're doing. They're doing a lot of duties. They're doing, but it's never patrolling and the presence mission, deterrence, and the things they have to do. Because if you don't have the fleet sitting there, you can run very quickly into problems like Hartlepool and all these things. If they're not doing their job, if they're not patrolling, if they're not training, if they're not sitting there, you have a huge amount of issues. But the trouble is, because they're doing their mission, their duties, nothing's happening, so people presume they're doing nothing. And navies have this issue, especially with the Cold War, because when we talk about the Cold War, people talk about Berlin, they talk about all this. They don't talk about the navies facing off against each other in the middle of the oceans because they don't see them.
Right.
But it's happening.
And it's not articulated in any way. And again, I go back to that idea. Okay, what is the roles and missions of your military? And you need to talk about them. In the study I'm doing in World War One is, April of 1917. They're looking at, okay, the submarine menace is becoming, a major. Excuse me, excuse me. The Germans are talking about sinking 600,000 tons a month as their objective. Well, they're sinking 800,000 tons. And, the British are sitting there. And at one point, there's the study on destroyer allotments, how we can put destroyers on these patrol routes on the western side of Great Britain. And you're looking at the Royal Navy destroyers, they have 300 something destroyers. And we don't have enough. It's like there's not enough destroyers that we need. And they break it down. I need 100 with the Grand Fleet. I need these in the Dover Channel. I need these on the East Coast. I need these here and there. And they come up with that shortfall. It's like we need 35 destroyers here south of Ireland. And that's what they asked the Americans for. But it's like, you look at that, you say 300 is not enough. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. comes up with that number for 4-stack destroyers. It's because they're looking at the British and they're saying, okay, the British have this number of destroyers and it's not enough. We need to build that many for ourselves. And again, you have to be able to articulate that and discuss it. My issue, I think I have with both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy today is that members of the Royal Navy, members of the U.S. Navy are not on logistics ships. It's the Royal Fleet Auxiliary for the Royal Navy. It's the Military Sea Lift Command for the United States. And so they don't really have that experience. Again, I go back reading this biography of King. King was a CO of a supply ship of the USS Bridge, AF-1, one of these store ships. And I really do think that when you command a logistics ship, you understand logistics a hell of a lot better. You start to understand what the logistics means. You have a better appreciation and understanding for that. When you detach it and you kind of make it separate, we tend not to think about it. It's me driving down the road complaining about a work crew fixing a road. It's like, why can't they do this another time? I don't have the full picture of what these road crews are doing to keeping highways and interstates and motorways open. And
that's the interesting thing to me, because if you consider, if I use the Royal Fleet Auxiliary example, but the reason they are kept civilian, of course, is the idea they can go into ports which you might necessarily get to. But the interesting thing, of course, is whenever they have aviation attachments on them, detachments of aircraft, helicopters, etc., they are from the Royal Navy. And usually, in my experience, and this is the same I found with the U.S. Navy, the people who are engineers who are put on in those attachments, aero engineers who've gone up through, who've been served on those units, always have a really fine understanding of logistics. But
Yep.
when was the last time you heard of a helicopter aero engineer becoming an admiral in charge of a fleet?
Well, I agree. You know,
I mean,
in my
because
study
the
of
reason
military.
I found those officers, and I found them, and I found the same in the US thing, that those officers go up, they get to a certain, they don't never seem to go higher, because also, the nicest way, if you're an engineering officer with that qualifications on aircraft, you can get so much money in the civilian economy. You can get, literally, it's right your ticket, you're so qualified on aircraft maintenance. It's quite scary.
In my study of military sea lift, you know, the very first commander of what is then the Military Sea Transportation Service is a guy by the name of Dan Callahan. Excuse me, not Dan. It's William Callahan. It's Dan Callahan's brother. It's the commander who dies on November 13th, 1942, in the melee off of Guadalcanal with the San Francisco Cruiser Task Force. His brother, William Callahan, and William Callahan is really interesting to me. He's kind of like he's always a step behind his brother. So he commanded, William Callahan commanded the Reuben James, the destroyer that was sunk at the beginning of World War II. It's sunk on Halloween, 1941. But he gives up command just before then. He's the first commander of the USS Missouri, but he's not on Missouri when the surrender takes place. He's always a step away. And he becomes he becomes a logistics commander. He's actually Nimitz's what's called J-41. He's the head of his logistics division. And he's a master of logistics. He really is. He's a brilliant guy who really understands logistics, which his brother didn't. I would argue his brother was terrible at it. And his brother was the chief of staff for Admiral Gormley down in the South Pacific. I think Dan Callahan, the brother who dies off Guadalcanal, is one of the chief architects for the defeat at Savo Island because he fails to ensure that Fletcher's carriers are fueled. And it's one of the reasons that Fletcher has to pull back his aircraft carriers. But some of the best commanders of military SEAL command I've seen over time are either people who are well versed in logistics or well versed in destroying logistics. My two favorite commanders of MSC are these two admirals, Glenn Donk Donahoe and Lawson Red Ramage. They're both sub commanders during World War II. And Ramage is one of the most famous. He wins a Medal of Honor. He's absolutely a terror of a sub commander. And there's a great interview. He's the commander of military SEAL command during Vietnam. And he was asked, he's like, what makes you a good commander for understanding military logistics? He says, because I destroyed it during World War II. He goes, I understand I understand where the weaknesses were because I exploited them as a sub commander in World War II. And he was absolutely correct. He understood entirely how to bring down an afloat logistics system. And unfortunately, I don't think we do that very well. You know, when we start talking about great power competition with the Chinese, and you know, every statistic you see and everything you hear is like, oh, the Chinese are outbuilding us 230 to 1. They've got this massive commercial fleet. They have all this. All their advantages are also disadvantages. They're vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And unfortunately, I don't think we do what the Royal Navy did prior to the World Wars. We're not looking at how to use the application of soft power against an enemy because it's a vulnerability. It's a vulnerability that the Chinese are always trying to minimize through Belt and Road and a whole variety of methods. Their logistics is trying to be as robust as it can be. Unfortunately, U.S. logistics and Royal Navy logistics are very vulnerable. There's not a lot of depth in them. And that's the scenario I did with the Bighorn grounding off of the coast, or the shutdown, for example, of the Red Hill facility in Hawaii. You know, we shut down the largest fuel reserve we had in the Pacific. I mean, we did what the Japanese didn't do on December 7th. We took out our fuel supply. And now what do you do when you have to wage a war across the Pacific?
Have a lot of
When you're out
trouble.
of gas and the nearest gas station is 7,000 miles away.
It's just, yeah, there are a lot. It's trying to explain also the depth of a war because it's not just the Royal Navy USA. It's a general problem you find, I would argue, not even in pretty much any military in the world. Pick any country you want, and logistics and trying to explain the depth of force you need is just not going to cut. It's not something. You sort of the amount of times I get into trouble because I talk about reserves a lot, and I talk about how you need more reserves, and the amount of people who go, "Well, no, you can't have reserves." Someone was honestly commenting on my channel the other day that you can't have modern warships like I know. I think I picked the Type 31s, 32s, etc. You could keep them in reserve instead of selling them off once you finish them. You keep them in reserve, and because they're going to be quite simple, light frigates, and you could build up a reserve force of frigates. Oh, you can't do that because you can't train a reservist to use modern systems. I'm sort of going, you can. Well, you can't get them to work together as a crew. You can. I'd argue, the sort of go, we did that. Oh, what you did it in World War II, but the systems were far simpler. But yes, the people in World War II, not all of them could read, and they still managed to get it to work and get the systems to work. These days, most people are computer literate to a lesser or greater extent. You can get them up to the provision in the systems you need them to be to work and to make reserves work. You just need to invest the time and money into it. And it's worthwhile because you need the depth of force. It would be more sensible to me that instead of some units like, again, Britain's doing this, but also America's done this. There are some units you get rid of. You get rid of at the end of their life. You sit there and go, they've still got life left in the hulls. It'd be useful to have them as reserve assets because you could use them for reserve assets. I'm not talking about literal combat ships here. I think they should probably have been burnt on a funeral pyre, but we'll leave that to one side.
Even the Greeks don't want them. If the Greeks don't want them, they're not good.
Yeah, the Greeks who basically will take anything that they can chuck at the Turks. I probably shouldn't say that too much, but nicest way. Greece and Turkey have an ongoing, interesting relationship. They might technically be in NATO together, but honestly, realistically, they always each other's more of the worry than anything else. It always seems to me whenever I talk to them. But the point is, we've got this idea from the Cold War, I think, especially the Cold War. The idea was, if you're fighting in the European theatre, logistics are going to be, there's going to be lots of places to draw logistics from. So that shortens your need for your range for logistics rather than the Pacific. Or truly global fighting. And then we've also got this idea that we're going to be fighting in a permissive environment because we have been for the last 30, 40 years in so many regards because we're going to be so technologically dominant. And you add those two things together and you've got the idea that, you don't need reserves because wars aren't going to be long enough to justify calling out the reserves. And they added that in. And now, and it's a really dangerous mixture you've now got. Because, to me, logistics are like reserves. It's about the capacity to be able to do something. And it's about the capacity to be able to do that thing longer term. Because if you think about it in World War II, and, it's you start off the war with the regulars. They buy you maybe a year. The reservists are what buy you the next year and a half. And it's 2.5, 3 years in, that's when you start to get the huge surge of people who are the war joiners coming in and actually are viable for operations. But if you hadn't had those reserves, if you hadn't had the regulars and the reserves, you would never have made it to the point at which you could start being in a place to receive those people. And what's more important, those reservists are now the people who are leading those people. A lot of them, if you think about the escorts in World War II, and even the escorts in World War I, a lot of the sloops, a lot of the corvettes, a lot of these things, they're senior officers. You look at them, they're all RNR, RNVR, USNR, they're all reservists. And that's another problem, I would say, because the fact is that's meant that a lot of their memories didn't get remembered. And a lot of their involvement doesn't get remembered.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, the amount of literature I see that any conflict in the Pacific is going to be a short war. I mean, the short war mentality. I mean, talk to Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, it was going to be a short war. The Russians had hoped for a short war. They aimed for a short war, but it wound up not being a short war because what we find out is economics plays a role and morale plays a role. And if you don't win a battle very quickly that undermines the enemy, then all of a sudden you get into a protracted war. When I just did a course, first time I did a semester of a course called World at Wars, where we looked at World War I, World War II. And what's really interesting is the mindset that went in. When my students looked at World War II, and after we looked at World War I, they were really fascinated in the concept that Germany wasn't fighting one big war. They were fighting a series of short little wars. They were fighting kind of, short little wars. That was Germany's mantra, fight a quick war. And they fought the Poles, they fought the Danes and the Norwegians, they fought the French. And the plan with the Russians was to fight a short war with the Russians. Quick decisive war. They are not geared for that. Even the Japanese plan short war. Let's go for a short war. Even though they got themselves in a bogged down in China, they envision a short war against the United States. The problem is once you shift over into the long war mantra, whether it's the Eastern Front in World War II or it's the Pacific in World War II, what wins is your economy. Your economy's got to be able to ramp up and to be able to maintain and outproduce the enemy. And you get into the grind. You get into that kind of churn. You get into, the Phillips O'Brien argument, where you basically start, it becomes a measure of production and capacity over that. And that's what you're talking about with reserves. I don't understand why the U.S. Navy, for example, got rid of Navy Reserve frigates. We got rid of them. We're just going to see the phase out of Arleigh Burke destroyers here because we're getting to the end of their service lives. You can roll them in for 5 years as a reserve destroyer, put crews on them locally, train them. And what you're creating is maybe that destroyer doesn't go out on a mission, but maybe the crews can be used as fillers. There are little things
The OHPs would have been perfect in a reserve role. Let's be honest. The tin cans were they were so simple, so easy. You could have kept the OHPs going as a reserve for years and had a decent little reserve frigate.
And every Navy in the world's doing it. It's like you look around the world and you can't help but run into a Perry running somewhere and hit it. And it's like, listen, it was easy. It was a gas turbine engine. It was easy to fix. It was easy to maintain. There wasn't that much with them. You can upgrade the weapon systems. You can take off the Mark 13, single arm launcher. You can put a small VLS system on it. They don't have to be robust. It's not what it's designed. It's designed for presence. What gets me is the U.S. Navy is in this fixation that everything's got to be able to do 40 knots and, be able to fight World War III on a moment's notice, when in truth, what you need sometimes is an Erie Class gunboat that has, it looks ridiculous. It's got 6-inch guns on it, but it's not designed to fight. It's designed to impress. It's designed to be a presence mission. It's not designed to go out there and go toe to toe with an enemy. It's designed. It's the River Class OPVs. It's you want your presence out there.
It's the obsession and the focus is, and this also affects logistics and all the other things. Is the focus is it has to be able to do it in the primary theatre, and you go, well, the trouble is you're also going to need assets in the secondary theatre.
Yep.
And the thing is, if all you have are primary assets, theatre assets, you're going to have to send one of those, take the stuff from there to go to that secondary theatre. You don't want to do that. You want to have something which you can send over there to do what you need to do over there.
Yep.
And it's for convoy escort. Again, how many ships on a convoy escort, if you're doing one today, are going to need to be your first rank warships?
Exactly. And it's not like that lesson hasn't been hammered home. So you take my study from World War I, fast forward it to World War II, and if you look at early in the U.S. entry into World War II, there's a massive German attack on the east coast of the United States. Not massive. It's initially 6 submarines, and there's more come over. But in the span of 6 months, 600 ships have sunk off the East Coast, Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea. And if you look at the allocation of American destroyers, there's a big hole. We don't have enough destroyers. Why do we not have enough destroyers? 2 reasons. Number one, we scrapped a crap load of them during the interwar years because we said we're not going to need them. We failed to heed the lesson the British learned in World War I. Second, we lend-leased 50 of them over to Great Britain in return for bases, which meant that we had to make a decision. Where are we going to put our resources? And what we decided to do is we got to put our resources on the West Coast and out in the Pacific to deal with the Japanese. We got to put them on the lend-lease convoys going across to Europe, to Great Britain, to Russia, and the area where we're going to denude our resources, where we just don't have enough to do anything, is going to be on the East Coast of the United States. That was a calculated decision. King and his commanders had to sit there and say, I've got a finite amount of resources. Where am I going to allocate them?
It's the fun thing about Lend-Lease, because it's the one I always like to point out to people is, what are the chief things which the British supply to the Americans on the Lend-Lease? People look shocked and go, they don't supply anything. I go, they do. Flower-class corvettes, river-class frigates, all sorts of these vessels are supplied to the Americans primarily for the Caribbean and the East Coast.
Yep.
Because the British have production lines going of them in Britain, in Canada, in Australia, all these places. And the Americans just go, there's a finite number of production lines we can set up, believe it or not.
There's a criticism of, constructions of destroyer escorts in the U.S. Like the U.S. builds way too many destroyer escorts. There's too many of them, and the U.S. gets fixated on building these. But the way they defeat the U-boats is, yes, I know about May 43 and we talked about this with the escort carriers and that. But the reason they're able to do that is because they've established a global convoy system. They're convoying everywhere. I mean, they're convoying the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, in the South Pacific, in the Eastern Pacific. They're convoying. There's no spot on the planet where German submarines don't run into a convoy by the time you get to 1943, because the US and the British have developed so many convoy escorts, they can form a interlocking global convoy system. And the Germans in 43 decide, okay, what's the one spot on the planet where I can get the best bang for my buck? And it's going to be the mid-Atlantic, where it's shorter range. I can get my U-boats in there. It's the air gap, at least for right now. And so they put all their eggs in one basket. And then what the US and the British do is concentrate their hunter killers, they concentrate their forces, and you have the just kind of, I don't want to say decisive battle, but afterwards the Germans decide they have to disperse their submarines, and you never quite get it back again. And that, again, that's a battle of logistics. It is a battle of how you're going to get there. It's as decisive as the issue with loading a Liberty ship. I had this discussion with James Holland at one point where we were talking about the importance of shipping, and Liberty ships were really interesting because in World War II you're building ships that have to be self-sustaining, they have to be able to offload themselves. But the reason you're building 30-ton Shermans is because the boom on most cargo ships is 30 tons. That's the biggest boom you have. It doesn't do you any good to build a 50-ton tank. You can't get it off. And to load a ship takes an inordinate amount of time. Ships spend more time in port than at sea. And so you have to take all this time to load the vessel and then unload them. One 11.5 knot Liberty ship may get you 4 crossings of the Atlantic in a given year. And, if it's peacetime, you probably get 6 out of it, maybe 8. But, in wartime, because of the pulse of convoys and the overloading of ports and the delays, that's what you get. And so it's not just a matter of shipping, it's a matter of how much you can turn your ships around. What happens when you send a convoy into Liverpool? What does that do to the port all of a sudden? Because now you got 40, 50 ships coming in. You've got to clear them out. You got to load ships going back. It's just this, plan. One of the things, I've been looking at with World War II is how the early 1939, 40, 41 period is, the Battle of Britain isn't just an aerial campaign, it's a maritime campaign. It is the British, it's the Germans forcing, convoys from going to the east coast of England onto the west coast of England, targeting the docks, because, what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine right now is, listen, we're not targeting commercial ships, but we're going to blow the crap out of the ports. We're going to hit Odessa. We're going to hit, Sevastopol. We're going to hit the Kerch Bridge. We're going to hit the infrastructure because, if we can't hit the ships, we'll hit the infrastructure. That will slow everything up. That's a World War I, World War II lesson right there.
And again, I wouldn't be surprised if they start targeting canal locks at some point.
No, because again, one of the things that, the British and the Americans start never failing to realize in the strategic bombing campaign against World War II is the importance of barge traffic for the Germans. It's late in the war when they start realizing how essential the inland waterway system is in Europe to the movement of goods. Americans are thinking roads. They're thinking roads and railways because that's what they have. That's in their mindset. They're not thinking European barge and river traffic, which is absolutely essential. And when you start hitting those, that creates big disruption. I have a lot of people always compare the U.S. inland waterway system to the European. And I always tell them the difference is European rivers just kind of go right into the interior, almost dead center into Europe all the time. You have the Rhine, Main, Danube Canal that bisects Europe. I mean, you literally sail from Rotterdam into the Black Sea. You can't do that in the U.S. You can't go from New York to San Francisco by boat. It doesn't exist. You got mountains in the way. It doesn't quite work.
And you've also got the British do try the Royal Air Force do try a mining campaign of the canals throughout the war. But one of the problems they have is, how do I put this? It starts to work out better once they shift it to mosquitoes, because they fly lower, they fly along the canal, and they drop the things in. But they start off the war by trying with Wellingtons, and they try and doing it almost high level, and it's just they're missing the canals. They do get some in the canals. They do get some, but you have fun with these things. But logistics is it's one of those interconnected issues. The trouble is, again, this is what I often say. There is an easy soundbite you can make for logistics, which is its life. Logistics is life, which is a great soundbite. But then you have to explain the rest of it. And that's usually when you lose people, because they're going, well, how can this be connected to this and this connected to this, this connected to this? Because everything is interconnected to everything. And people, I don't like the idea that sometimes people put forward that the modern electorate or something, people are dumb, or that you didn't need to explain it to a wide group of people when you're making a case for a navy in the 18th century or something like that. You do. You always have to make it to a wider group of people. The Royal Navy gets the funding it does because of the merchants of London and the merchants of the merchant guilds, and explaining it to them, which is a very large group of people for that time period. It's not the ruling class. It's not the king deciding it. It's the merchants. They are prepared to fund it, and they will give them the money. And you have to explain. You always have to explain the case Navy to a wide group of people. But the trouble is the time people have to sit and listen to these things. If you consider when we're talking, we started off talking about Mahan. It seems a good place to sort of consider as we sort of wrap this up, because I think we are at the point we're sort of considering wrapping it up. Mahan is writing in a time where people had the time to sit down and read quite a dense book. And whilst today, when most people reading Mahan, they read the first chapter. And again, if I get my copy out of Mahan here, you consider this book. It's a fun book to read. But realistically, the first chapter, which is what most people do seem to have read of Mahan when you listen to their quotes and discussions, is that bit.
Right.
The second chapter is called Strategy, Tactics, and Logistics. This is sales technique of this his period. This is how he's selling the value of the US Navy. This is what these books are. But these days, when you're selling the U.S. Navy, or selling the Royal Navy, or selling any navy to the politicians, to the media, etc., it's a page of bullet points at best. You get time to produce it in. And the trouble is, I would say, with logistics, is to make logistics make sense in a way which sells it. It takes more than a page of bullet points. Am I right or am I wrong?
No.
I'm often wrong in life.
Well, I think the other element is you have to make the comparison so people understand it. Talking about military logistics and comparing it to civilian logistics is it's the comparison. I live in North Carolina. We have hurricanes here. Logistics to me is when a storm hits and my power goes out, I'm not going to go out and string power lines. The power company is going to do it. That's logistics. That's in place. What happens is when you interdict logistics, there's no one coming out stringing your power. So I've got to work with generators. I got to do something to make do till it comes up. That's the problem with logistics. That is contested logistics. And my problem right now in the military and even in the civilian government is they assume elements of logistics that doesn't always work. So for example, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU and the G7 came out with this idea is like, we want to hurt Russia economically. How can we do that? And obviously, if you're going to hurt Russia economically, it's their oil, it's their fuel, it's their petroleum. How do we do that? So they come up with this plan to basically allow Russia to sell oil and diesel, but at a fixed price or below a fixed price, $60 a barrel for crude, $100 a barrel for diesel. And the question is the enforcement. How do we enforce that? Well, we're going to use the insurance companies. We're going to use the 12 big insurance companies under the international P&I clubs, protection and indemnity clubs, and we're going to use insurance to enforce this. I said from the very beginning, okay, you're misunderstanding what's going to happen right now. Yes, the international P&I clubs will not insure vessels that are selling oil over that limit. But the Russians are just going to go find insurance somewhere else, or they'll self-insure, or they'll do something to get around it. It's like you're just forcing them to do something different. And the argument was, well, that's fine. Go ahead and let them do that. That will be a burden on them. And instead, what we see is the creation of what's sometimes called the dark fleet, the ghost fleet, the shadow fleet. I call it a parallel fleet. But you're creating these kind of bifurcated commercial shipping fleets out there. And again, that's a misunderstanding of logistics. Everyone who knew anything about shipping could say that, not just me. It's not that I have any brains in this at all. But anyone who understood that could sit there and say it. Same thing with deploying a strike group across the entire ocean and having just a single ship being its node of fuel. It's like, okay, what's the vulnerability here? It's that single point is the vulnerability, which is, I did this story about the Bighorn being grounded, and I got a lot of flack. I had people tell me it's like you're highlighting our weaknesses to the enemy. The enemy knows the weaknesses. I'm not advertising anything they don't
Oh
know.
yeah.
And if they don't know it, we should know it. We should be aware of what our weakness is, because this can happen tomorrow. What is plan B, C, and D for logistics? I was amazed when I did that Six Oilers study, and I looked at the logistics plan for April 1942 down in the Coral Sea, and then I looked at the one that they developed in August of 42 for Guadalcanal. The one for April 1942 was beautiful. It was a beautiful plan. I mean, Nimitz is putting not 2 carriers in the Coral Sea, but 4. He's bringing Enterprise and Hornet down after the Doolittle raid. And it's a symphony of movement of oil down there. It is an amazing, really well thought out logistics plan. When you get to August of 42, which is a very hurried operation, the Guadalcanal invasion, Operation Watchtower, and its nickname Shoestring for a reason, is really cobbled together. It is not well thought out. And then you have a new staff down in South Pacific, Admiral Gormley with Admiral Dan Callahan as his chief of staff. That's where you see the flaw happen. It's like they don't understand how to do this logistically. And what winds up is Fletcher with 3 carrier strike groups arrive off the south shore of Guadalcanal on August 7th, but his ships are at 60% fuel. They should have been 100%. They should have been topped off, heading into battle, ready to go. Instead, he's looking at his fuel gauges going, I got to leave. It's like, I cannot stay here. And that is, forcing him to pull back earlier. I know a lot of people want to say it's his loss of fighters. It's not. It's the fuel issue. He's got to get out of there. And it's those issues that unfortunately don't get a lot of attention. There's a lot of, I just saw an interview with the commander of the USS Cole, Kirk Lippold. And so he talked about Cole being in Aden in 2000 and the attack against his ship that lost, I think it was 17 crew members are killed. And I look at that attack, and the reason he's in the port of Aden in Yemen in 2000 is because there's no underway replenishment vessel. He had to go into port to refuel because he was tasked to move his ship very quickly at last minute, so there wasn't thought about this. He is burning through his fuel, and when he arrives in the Persian Gulf, he's got to be topped off. And so instead he goes into the port of Yemen. He starts refueling. The Al Qaeda cell that's there had been watching this take place. They did a run through earlier in the year against another destroyer, the Sullivans, and what you get is an attack that cripples an American destroyer, almost sinks it. And again, it's not that the ship was vulnerable; it's a logistics vulnerability. If that logistics vulnerability had not been there, you don't expose the vessel. And that's what I worry about with the Royal Navy. It's the Royal Navy can have all the aircraft carriers it wants. If it doesn't have a dry store supply ship to get food, toilet paper, and bombs to it, and enough tankers to refuel it, those carriers are paper carriers because they can't last long.
I think the trouble is people look at it in terms of the wrong thing, because they look at it almost like it's the carrier's fault. The carriers aren't the issue. It's the fact that they came with this program, the carriers were going to be the cornerstone of it, and they haven't funded the program. It's not the carriers that are. It's the whole. They had this whole problem. The carriers weren't being built in isolation. This is the point. It's the same with the American force structure. You don't build your force structure in isolation. The British Navy wasn't building the carriers and going, then we're going to leave. You go back and look at the 1998 SDSR and all the things that come on. There's a whole plan for. There's going to be this many supply ships. There's going to be this many destroyers. This many frigates. This many, and the carriers are part of that force. And then they built the carriers, but they haven't built the rest of the force. And then they're going, oh, what do we do? And they're making all sorts of silly decisions. But they often do. It's the thing I've been worried about with the Red Sea deployments. And you've talked about this with the coal, etc. It's the fact that where are the ships having to go to resupply for missiles? Where are they going to have to go to resupply for fuel? They're having to go into port. They're going to have to go into port in one of the most, it's okay, it's a nice port to go to, but they're going into port. And to me, that's a weakness. And then someone turned around to me, and I was talking about that the other day, and they went, oh, yes, but we've just demonstrated we can resupply at sea now. I'm like, you've done an exercise. You've done it. Great. Lovely. Are you resupplying your destroyers operating in the Red Sea from at sea? No, you're not. So don't call it a capability until you're doing it routinely. It's not. It's something you've demonstrated we could theoretically do now. But it's going to be a long time before it's a capability unless you put a lot of money into it.
Oh, and the Navy, U.S. Navy has been touting this VLS at sea. You know, this system we had in the 80s. I mean, we've done this before.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the system in the 80s, and we got rid of it because, again, the VLS system was designed to deal with backfire bombers launching AS-4s in a red storm rising environment where you deal with, you know, waves. And so you can, you know, the idea with VLS is we need to launch more missiles than the twin arm launchers could do. And thanks to Aegis, we can control more than 4 missiles in the air at a time. And so we need to get a lot of missiles up and engage. The problem you have now with drones and smaller, you know, asymmetric threats that are coming at you. And even the test that was recently done, it was done on a cruiser. There's 3 left in the U.S. Navy. That's the only platform that has the system. And what no one talks about is the fact is that the American supply ship can't carry that many VLS rockets to begin with because there's a finite storage space because they weren't designed to carry VLS rocket. They're really big. They're really large. They need to be down in the magazine and they can't fit in the elevators. And so, you know, and it's a really slow system. It is not fast. Understand, the problem you have is you got to remove the VLS cells off the ship, return them to the delivery ship, and then get the new VLS cells. So this is absolutely slow. And it's one of the reasons we had an early debate on Bilge Pumps about this, about the old single and dual arm launches, which were great because you had arsenal. You basically just repack up you just bring the missiles over, load up the magazine, and off you go. And in some ways, that's almost better. But what you're talking about is understanding that a carrier and a Navy is part of a larger system, and you got to have all elements of the system. If you don't have the integrated system together, the system doesn't work because everything falls apart. And it's just like it becomes it's not just you're missing 10% of the system, you're missing the key 10% of the system. But again, this is a U.S. Navy that's designing ships and building ships that are not fully designed yet. And, you know, that goes back to the underpinning of how do you build a house when you don't have the plans for the ground store yet? You know, I got the upstairs, but I don't have the ground floor yet. How do you build a house that way? That's the way they're building ships. And that underpins or actually it knocks the underpinning out of all your planning. Because if you can't do that logistically, you can't do that in anything else. And unfortunately, the Navy at least the U.S. Navy does a very bad job, in my opinion, of understanding their role in this larger logistic system. The U.S. Navy should be touting that it is the key linchpin to logistically support not just itself, but the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, Space Force, and its allies. Yet they don't want anything to do it because no admiral has ever become an admiral flying his flag from a fuel ship, a store ship, a cargo ship. I mean, we have 2 salvage ships left in the Navy right now. We're building a whole class of them, but none of them are there. And, you know, salvage ships are really important when you take damage because commercial tugs and salvage ships are not going to come in. The Red Sea has demonstrated that. How do you get your damaged carrier, cruiser, destroyer out of there if you can't tow it free? You're going to lose it. And again, we're building a dozen of these things, but what we did is get rid of the dozen we had, and now we're down to 2.
And you sort of go, this is not a ship. These are not vessels which need to be actively used to be viable. You could have them sitting ashore. You could sitting in a harbour, and you could have a reserve crew or something that you can put on them. That's the reality. I do think, though, I did have a fun conversation where someone said, "Oh, we don't need RFA, and we don't need to enlarge the RFA or have a reserve for all fleet auxiliary the other day because they said no, we could just recruit merchant sailors." If you're doing ships taken up from trade, if you consider the Falklands War, which we also discussed at the beginning of this, in that war, they had a huge issue because the number of merchant ships which did not have British merchant crews, even though they were British merchant marine flags, they didn't always have it. And whilst many did go down, many merchant mariners from places did go down, there were some countries which said no. And so their sailors couldn't go down and they had to be replaced. Now, that was in, let's be honest, rather diplomatically and politically charged, but rather more simple polar world of the Cold War, where there were two sides, and you're either on that side or you weren't. Today, that could be a lot more problematic because, as you mentioned, the Philippines now provides a huge, overwhelming number of the merchant sailors around the world. If they said no, you're in real trouble. If they said, oh, we don't want to get involved in this and we don't want our citizens involved in this, you're in trouble. And how do you deal with that? Where do you get the people from?
I mean, where was the Royal Navy statement on the reflagging and the recrewing of the P&O ferries, which were absolutely essential for the British in 82? If you look at P&O ferries and the role they play, the Elk, the whole series of them that went down there, they were absolutely just key for British success. And again, in the United States, we just had the unveiling of this new Ships Act for America, which is trying to actually start a revitalization of U.S. shipping. We're seeing in other countries. Australia's talking about it. New Zealand's talking about it. Hopefully, Great Britain talks about it. Hopefully, other countries start looking at this in some ways. If you look at the countries right now that are building commercial and naval ships, Japan, Korea, and China, they understand that this is really important for them because of the issue of defense in and around East Asia. It's not, they're not doing it just because it's economically for them. Japan, Korea, and China have defense issues. They do. Nobody likes Japan. Korea has an issue where it's very concerned about its neighbors, and China is now the dominant shipbuilder on the planet. China has become what Great Britain once was, 100 years ago. And they're building the largest navy on the planet. They have the largest merchant marine on the planet, basically. They're the largest shipbuilder on the planet. They're developing, basically bases and ports around the planet as part of their Belt and Road initiative. I would argue, I always argue that Chinese are not communistic, they're not capitalistic, they're mercantilistic. They're kind of embracing the old British East India Company mantra there of what their role is. We just had this piracy attack off Somalia on a Chinese vessel. I'm going to be very interested to see the Chinese reaction to this because the Somalis are demanding $10 million from China for the release of this. This to me is the reason the PLAN was built, is to go down there. And if you see a strike group sail from China to the coast of Somalia, I don't think the Chinese are going to be number one. I think they're going to try to bribe him off. They'll pay him off. They'll do something behind the scenes, number one, because that's Chinese would do that in a second. But I don't think they're going to be really bashful in trying to exert some pressure. There's a change going on, a rotation of the escort group out of Djibouti, which, I mean, the Chinese haven't been doing much regarding the Houthi, but I don't think they want to do much against the Houthi. They're not really impacted by them. And so, but the Somali pirates may be a different matter. It'll be interesting to see how they play that one out.
Yeah, it's one of those things of, you have to remember that just because things might not apply to you now doesn't mean they won't apply to you later. And because you don't recognize it as a problem doesn't mean other countries don't think it's a problem. When you're looking at the scenarios, it's one of the issues you have in international relations is people going, well, this isn't a problem for us, and so we're not bothered about it. It could become a problem for you later on, and it's a problem for other people right now. And what I would say with all this is the sort of the piracy. I'll be interested to see how the Chinese react. I think, like you, they'll probably do something behind the scenes. But when the Russians were down there, didn't the Peter Velicki, isn't one of the few times it's fired an anti-ship missile, was one of the scenarios versus a pirate mothership?
Think so, but I don't remember. It was early. That was in the 2010s, I think it was.
It launched one of its big missiles, and basically a pirate vessel got taken out by a flying bus. The normal way of doing things for the Russians. They're either not doing anything, or we are applying everything to this. But yeah, logistics.
So, oh yeah. The bread and butter, man. I love this house.
We tried to start off with something positive to distract people from the UK television. I'm not sure if it has ended that way. So, the thing is, are there any good things coming through? I would say, personally myself, the one thing I am, whilst I don't agree with getting rid of Albion and Bulwark like they're doing, etc., I do wish that Britain was completing the part of its plan, which had not just aircraft carriers, but LHDs replacing Albion, Bulwark, and Ocean, and all sorts of fun things. But yeah, the new multi-role amphibious warfare vessels and other things, they could be really interesting. They could be really interesting. But I would say on the side of that, they haven't even been ordered yet. They've just been committed to, but they haven't been ordered to yet. So we'll see what actually comes from it. But the US Navy's their small amphibious ships they were looking at has that program been paused now?
It has been. This is their landing ship medium, the LSMs. There are so many commercial designs out there that are viable. I just it goes back to how the U.S. orders vessels and put designs. It's a fight between the Marines and the Navy. They don't want to talk about it, but the Marines want basically an expendable ship, and the Navy doesn't like that term, and so they put a lot of provisions in them to make them much more robust than they are. I mean, basically what they're building are LCLs. They're, Sir Lancelot's basically what the RFA had back in the day, is what they want. And there's commercial Damien and a few other companies building. The Japanese just built a version of this. I think they want something to tool around in the first island chain, which, okay, that's great. It's going to be expendable because you're not going to be able to defend it. And it just goes back to what is the roles and missions. The Marines are talking about putting these littoral regiments on these islands. I saw an interesting map the other day that actually, it sounds impressive when you look at the range of these missiles, but then when you superimpose it on a map of the Pacific and you realize it's a little tiny blip off the island, it's like it's really not that distance. It's not that far. It's with a naval strike missile and even with a Tomahawk, it's like the Pacific is a big ocean. I don't think they realize how big it is. And unless the enemy is sailing into your missile envelope, you're not going to hit them. And I just think that they're not applying. It just seems like every service in the U.S. has its own mission or its own idea of how to deal with war in the Pacific. There doesn't seem to be the kind of Plan Orange that looked at the entire thing holistically. I hope there's a modern version of Plan Orange being worked out.
Well, I'd say the good symptom of that is the fact that the logistics and these things aren't being looked at. Because
No.
it's only once you start looking at the things holistically that you start going, oh, frigate, we need that. Oh, sugar. And you don't have these. I don't know how. I'm not quite sure if the US gets into the same issue, but in the UK, every time there's a funding battle, it's more the various services just keep picking on each other.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just a constant fight. And you sit there and go, it's one of the reasons why I wince every time you talk about the aircraft carriers, because I understand what you're saying. But I've now got almost a Pavlovic response because I'm so used to people going, oh, if we didn't have the aircraft carriers, we'd have a division of tanks, a full armor division. I go, no, you wouldn't.
No.
A nice way. Don't think that just because the money hadn't been spent on aircraft carriers, it would have in any way been spent any better. And the thing is, it was supposed to be spent on the aircraft carriers at the same time as the Army was supposed to be getting their stuff, and the Air Force was supposed to be getting their stuff. And all of them have got bits of their programs. None of them have got the complete program. And it's no one's fault in the services. It's not even, I can't even really blame the Treasury because they're always charged with looking after the nation's finances. It's because the politicians come in and change their minds every 5 minutes. You can't build a supply ship which is going to be in service for 40 years, a system which is supposed to be built around 40 years, and keep changing your mind every few minutes.
And the U.S. Navy loves to build. They developed this 30-year shipbuilding plan, and I always go back with the 30-year shipbuilding plan. And it's like, do we really know what's going to be what we need in 55? It's because I think about if there's a 30-year shipbuilding plan in 1890, it wouldn't include dreadnoughts. If there was one in 1910, it wouldn't include aircraft carriers. If there was one in 1940, it wouldn't include nuclear submarines. It's the concept that you can know what you want your Navy to be in 30 years is aspirational, but it's not true. You really have to look at what you need now and what you're going to need in the short term. And again, one of the underpinnings is always logistics. It's always that supply. You need to be able to sustain it. One of the things that when you talk about World War II and the Americans getting into the war in December of 41, is when Nimitz comes out to Pearl Harbor and assumes command there in Christmas of 41. At the end of that time period there, he knows he's got a Navy coming to him. He knows the Naval Act of 1940, which builds on the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, has got 13 Essex-class carriers on the ways coming to him. If you're Admiral Paparo right now, you ain't getting no new carriers. You got what you got, and you don't even have 11 aircraft carriers. You can be lucky to get 3 or 4 in the short term, if you're lucky. It's going to be a much different style of warfare, and you got to be able to sustain them. What gets me is since the end of the Cold War, as we talked about before, is we've just seen a progression in really the diminishing of the size of the logistics fleet. We went from a very robust logistics fleet that had commercial tankers, it had military sea lift command tankers crewed by government employees, to U.S. Navy tankers with U.S. Navy crews with defense weapons on them. Now we're down to just basically MST tankers, which are unarmed, and they do the mission for everybody. And that is a weakness in your logistics. It's very easy to find the weakness in your logistics. And I don't think most people are taking the time to look at that. I think the enemies are. If you look at what the Chinese are doing, their Chinese studies of World War II look at that. There was a study put out, I think it was by the CSBA, on Chinese writings about studies they did on the war in the Pacific, and they looked at 3 campaigns, and in all 3 of those campaign studies they did, there's a massive section on logistics they looked at, and they looked at vulnerabilities, and unfortunately we tend not to do that in many ways.
And one of the things that's fun is if you look at the Falklands War, which we've been talking about a lot, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary deployed, I'm just going to check my maths on this, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22 ships to the Falklands War. And of those, logistics-wise, there were, how to put it, the Knights of the Round Table, the LSLs, Landing Ship Logistics, they accounted for 6 vessels deployed. Then you have the forts, 2 vessels, Fort Austin, Fort Grange, and then you have Resource and Regent, which are sort of supply ships / bit oiler, and then pretty much all the rest are oilers.
Yep.
Pretty much all the rest are oilers. The Leaf class and the Ulmer class, which we definitely on the Tide Pool and all those things, all these massive oilers. We couldn't do that today. We don't have the ships. We literally do not have the ships, and you do not have that level of resilience.
And when you think
oilers,
about when you think about the fact that every 3 days you have to refuel, it's just it's because you can't get low. I mean, when Cole pulls into Aden, they're at 50% fuel. That drives Navy commanders crazy. They don't want to be anywhere near that. They want to be 80% fuel. They always want to be topped off, because we forget that most of the time they're steaming at a cruising speed, a economical speed. When you ramp up your speed, as you get faster, it exponentially increases your fuel. And I did a graph for Task Force 11 in the raid against Rabaul in March of 42. This is the Lexington group. And when you look at the Lexington group sailing, it's consuming about 5% of its fuel every day. When it goes in on its run into Rabaul, it jumps up. It's consuming over 10%, 15% fuel per day. And that graph just falls off a cliff. And you realize how little fuel you actually have when you're steaming at that speed. And, again, for the U.S., a nuclear aircraft carrier has no problem. It'll put the throttle down and just burn neutrons. It doesn't have a problem. But the Burke-class destroyers in its wake are going to be struggling to keep up. More importantly, their fuel gauges are going to go down because we use gas sucking LM2500 gas turbines. And you got to have a string of oilers. Every time everyone tells me, well, we can move the carriers from the East Coast of the United States to Asia very fast. It's like, well, number one, you can't. I mean, we're seeing that right now because going through the Red Sea, the Truman's got to strike the Houthi to even sail through the region. You're talking about going around Africa. And if you're fueling destroyers, we don't have oilers in the South Atlantic. I mean, you're talking about having to pull those ships into ports.
This is the whole reason I keep saying you're going to need nuclear cruisers back, my friend. You're going to need the nuclear cruisers.
Oh, I know. I agree.
You don't have enough oilers. Yeah.
It was the whole reason to have them.
Anyway, on that, I think we probably depressed people enough for Christmas Day.
Well, Alex, listen, if I knew this is the Christmas show, I would have been much more Christmassy. I would have wore a Christmas shirt, I would have wore a Christmas hat, but I can do one thing here to make it more Christmassy. Here we go. There we go. My lights are on. There you go. So a little Christmas spirit here.
I hope you all have a wonderful time, and thank you for doing this, because it's always fun to have a chat with you. I hope you enjoyed.
It is always a pleasure to talk with you, Alex. You know that, and I'm happy that you asked me on. Sorry it took long for us to get here. People don't know we had a little bit of a coordination issue, but I'm happy to be here and to be on the
But
holiday edition of Two
yeah,
Historians. I'm very
it's the
excited.
fun. It's the fun thing. I have found it's don't take this wrong way, but got into this and I hadn't organised guests for bilge pumps in over a year, so I had because we've been dealing with all the things we've been moving around and organising that, and it's supposed to be coming back soon. And then this is organising the two historians has started giving me all the flashbacks of all the joys of trying to organise guests for bilge pump.
It is a tough thing to
Oh
herd cats. Historians are terrible because you know us. We're
yeah,
terrible. We're terrible at
we
schedules.
we always have things on. Anyway, thank you very much so much. Do you talk about your new book? When's that going to be coming out? That one.
I am hoping to do some writing over the summer and get it done. It's going to be another year or so. I just need.
Yeah.
My problem is I am chair of a history department. I run my YouTube channel. I have a life, and it's just my opportunity to do it. This over this break, I'm sitting here. I've just reopened everything up. I'm writing again, which is great. There are sections I'm doing, so I'm doing pieces and pieces. I
Yeah.
hope to have a presentation up at McMullen, up at the Naval Academy in September. But I hope by next year to have it put together.
That'll be good. I'll look forward to it when it comes out. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you. Can I just thank you, everyone?
So sorry that didn't turn out quite as happy and uplifting as I hoped it was going to be, but we're talking about logistics, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about the things which need to be talked about. And why are we talking about them at Christmas? Because as much as I did love doing the Santa Sleigh video, and I really do recommend if you've got kids especially, it's turned out to be quite a big hit with my little cousins, so I'm presuming quite a lot of kids will quite enjoy that. It's also a time of year that you have a bit of time to take a step back and think about things. That you can think about things properly. And I know Sal's doing a lot of things about the Ships for America Act and a lot of things currently going in the UK about the Defence Review. We've got to take time to think things through. Too many decisions these days are made knee-jerk. They are literally governments reacting to headlines. And that's not good. That's not good for you, that's not good for me, that's not good for anyone, that's not good for a nation. Things have to be read through thoroughly and in detail. I tried to make a point, but I think I made it poorly, especially when I've considered it backwards, about Mahan, This is what Mahan had to put forward his case. This is what Corbett had to put forward his case. Well, yeah, Corbett had to put forward his case. Mahan didn't stop there, neither did Corbett, but it's easy for me to reach the Mahan extra documents here. This was actually the book I was looking for when we were live chatting. These documents are well thought out, long papers. They aren't snippets, they aren't 50 words or 10 bullet point position pieces. They are proper thought through documents. And whilst I realise it's doubtful that the people who have been watching this video have only just made it through the first chapter of Alfred Fair Mahan, I do consider it doubtful. I'm sure you've made it further, if not completed the whole thing, or in the process of doing so. It's worthwhile thinking that communication these days often boils down to trying to inform the decision makers to a level at which they have this level of information. And maybe it's better to give it to them in video form. Maybe it's better than podcast. Maybe it's better in a book. But everyone's different and everyone learns differently. But whatever the thing is, we need to find a way to reach policymakers, to reach the decision makers, to make sure they're properly informed so they may hopefully have the best chance to make a decision which is the correct one. And you can only make a correct decision if you have all the information properly available. And it's all properly structured in its availability. And what do I mean by proper structure? I mean the sources and the information is weighted according to their veracity, their value, their reality. One of the things we often discuss on this channel, when we talk about more modern stuff, when we're talking on bilge pumps between me and the crew on bilge pumps, and I know that's been away for a year, but it is coming back. It is. I know. You miss your friends. One of the things we often discuss are drones and the future of drones and how they're going to be used. And we get into critiques quite often. I know, you miss your friends in Australia. I know. You're a good boy. We get into critiques quite often because we're not sufficiently bullish. We still see uncrewed assets, especially at sea, as being most often deployed as part of a force or as adjuncts to, rather than being deployed independently. But one of the reasons we do that, and we see them like that, is because of the rules of the sea and the way the rules of the sea are structured, and the way the rules of the operations are structured. And I have another book around here which is literally Rules of the Sea. I can't see it now, that's kind of helpful, it's disappeared on me. But the thing is, these books, they're all structured around crewed craft, and they have rules which reflect them being crewed. And unless we're going to massively rewrite the laws of the sea, which probably we need to, because let's be honest, one of the joys of the world in terms of maritime law is that the often estimate is that less than 5% of maritime law is actually written down and codified, and the remainder of the law is either unwritten, yet to be written, or is tradition, and is interpreted as law through practice. It's fun. Maritime law is fun. Naval law is fun. And then there's the fact that in wars, nations very rarely keep to them. We have some interesting things going on, as we pointed out, in Ukraine and Russia at this moment, in that they are doing a lot of effort they can to try and keep the war in certain spheres. That only lasts as long as both sides believe they have an equal chance of winning. Doesn't matter if they do have an equal chance of winning, or if they don't. As long as they believe they do, they will keep to certain rules. But nations, once they're losing, good example is Germany in World War One. What they were prepared to do when they thought they were winning, or when they thought they had a chance to win, versus what they were prepared to do when they thought they were losing, there is a very big difference. And the trouble is, logistically, infrastructurally, and in terms of force depth, you have to plan for the latter case. You can't afford to bank on the former case, because you might find yourself in that situation. Whether you are on the winning side or the losing side, you really should prepare for the latter case. For working out what are you prepared to do to survive, and what you might need to do against an opponent who believes that their survival is on the line. So, with that very, very happy thought to end, happy Christmas. I hope you're having a good day. If you're alone, I hope you find some company, or at least find the videos which are enjoyable and keeping you company. I know you don't like the idea of people on their own, but some people are on their own on Christmas. It's sad, but it's true. And it's often through no fault of their own. But people sometimes are on their own. I know. You don't like the thought of anyone on being on their own. You don't even like the thought of me going to the loo on my own. You big filthy beast. Up you come. Oh! Right. But if you're with family, I hope you have fun with family. If you're with friends, I hope you have fun with friends. And if you're alone, again, I hope you find a way to have a fun day. Because Christmas, it's a time to reflect, and it's a time to have fun and take a bit of time off, really. Hope you have a good day, and take care. Yes, I got you a new jumper. I shouldn't give him hints of what present he's got, but he picks it himself. Take care, everyone.